I know you've been on the ground working with disaster relief in the midst of the hurricane that just shook a whole lot of states, including yours. And it's not the first, second, and third. We're talking, Katrina, and it's like every year you're in that belly, of the eye of that storm always coming your way. What drove you to organizing, and what drove you to becoming an activist to provide justice?
Yeah, no, again, thank you for having me. I think, for power, so I spent a lot of my career in philanthropy. In fact, I worked for the Disaster Recovery Foundation right after Hurricanes Katrina. And so I did Hurricanes Katrina, Rita, Gustav, Ike, BP oil spill. That happened on my birthday. And I tease folks, that's when I said I had to stop living in the disaster paradigm. And what it taught me was that, like, we had the Bush Clinton Katrina funds. So we had like $50 million. We had access to people with power, but we weren't getting enough money to the ground, and change wasn't happening fast enough for the people, most deeply impacted. And so, Power Coalition really is an outgrowth of that very work of, like, how do we drive, federal dollars to the people who need it most, and, and move beyond disaster capitalism and the folks that typically make money off of disasters, while folks are still left, without the things that they need, and then consistently going through disaster time after time. And at some point, the housing stock and all of the things, right, just can't take it anymore. And so for us, for me, it's been about building a pathway to power for folks who haven't traditionally had a voice, and trying to move the needle for them, and put them in direct contact with decision makers, which are the elected officials in their communities that are making decisions about ARPA dollars, disaster recovery dollars, whatever those dollars are. How are we creating greater power and accountability at the community level for those dollars to actually reach them and do the things they're supposed to?
Actually, when I hear you talk about sort of this disaster economy that has evolved for folks in Hurricane Alley and other places like Mississippi and Louisiana, it also makes me think about the fact that how do we hold people accountable for how money is actually spent when money is earmarked and that sort of thing? And how do we get more people aware, more of the citizens aware and involved in that accountability? I think about all of these dollars that will eventually make their way into organizations that are supposed to serve Black folks post George Floyd, but I know how that Katrina situation was. I know how long my parents waited for their insurance company to pay out, let alone how long people who didn't have insurance waited for that FEMA money and all of those dollars that were supposed to go down during Katrina. It's people that still never got that money and definitely didn't get the numbers that they said. How do we think about understanding what accountability looks like? How can we put accountability in the hands of the people and not think, oh, well, some organization somewhere over there is going to call them out or hold them accountable? How do we get to that?
I think it's, I always say that there's so much power and truth, in the words, at some point folks get sick and tired of being sick and tired. And I think that we're there, where folks are worn out, and we're at a place where I think, we have the compounding traumas of both, COVID and the Delta variant ravaged our state 2 weeks before the storm. We had the highest number of deaths we've seen since COVID, as well as some of the highest incidences of COVID. And so, and then Ida hits, right? And so I think that, for me, I think that, helping people push and drive those dollars to the ground has been just making those direct connections, because I've been through so many storms, because I know how FEMA works. I know the staff that then drives, how FEMA then acts, right? And so, and so part of it is that, you kind of work in the top and the bottom, the grass tops and the grassroots, because you gotta, at one point, so for example, the thing that stopped the Ninth Ward from being rebuilt in New Orleans, they fixed that in the Stafford Act this year. So they addressed the airship issue around having clear title to your home because of the impacts in Tennessee from flooding and other natural disasters. But that was the very same provision within the Stafford Act that stopped the Ninth Ward from being able to rebuild fully, and for those families to be made whole on the other side of Hurricanes Katrina. And so we've got some work to do at the federal level to actually fix the Stafford Act so that it does what it's supposed to do. And then I think
for people who don't get that, can you talk a little bit about that clear title to property just a little bit so people can understand what you're talking about? Because this happens in Mississippi and Louisiana a lot in terms of getting funding and disaster recovery.
Sure. So basically what happens is, I mean, you know how it goes. Big mama dies. She leaves the house, to your auntie. Her sisters and brothers, they're not worried about it. She took care of big mama, so she gets the house, but there's no legal title that gets exchanged between big mama and auntie. And there's no succession of the property. So there's no clear heir. There's no clear title to the home. And so when that happens, what the federal government says is that I can't give money to, when all these people technically have ownership, because without clear succession, it's auntie and all her sisters and brothers and all of their kids that now have some stake of ownership in this property. In reality, in our families, we know that these properties get handed down generation to generation. And many times are multi-generational homes in and of themselves, right? Where you have multiple generations living within the same home. And so what they did was they actually, Ossoff worked with a couple of folks at the congressional level, and they fixed it this year for Tennessee. And so now I'm working in Louisiana.
So what does the fix look like?
So basically what they've decided is that there are other ways to show ownership of your property. And so now I've got to go work and educate all the folks in Louisiana and Mississippi across the Gulf Coast to say, that for the folks that won't even apply because they remember what happened during Katrina, to say, that's no longer an issue. You can now, there are multiple ways to prove ownership, and that's through, electricity bills, anything that's in your name that you are consistently paying on this piece of property. You can now, receive FEMA funds because you can show that, that you have some level of ownership of that dwelling. And so that's, that's exciting. That's huge because again, it is one of the singular things that you can point to for why the lower Ninth Ward never came back as strong as it could have, was because of these issues. And so what you took away, generational wealth in a community, and it was never able, to rebound. And then I think it's one of the other things I think is really important to this is about trusting people with money. We trust businesses. So the PPP loans, we got that money out the door. We wanted businesses to rebound. We even had a back end for fraud, or all the fraud that they worried about. But we didn't worry too much about it because it was businesses, and we pushed those dollars out the door and we saved the economy. But when it comes to disasters, we don't want to give folks that same opportunity to trust people to do what's right for their family and their homes, right? Where's, just like the child tax credit, this is $300 that's going into everybody's bank account that qualifies. It's going to their bank account every single month through the end of the year. These things are game changers. We've seen how this is being a game changer in our communities, especially communities of color across this country. But when it comes to disaster, we have to start getting to the same place. All the bureaucracy and layers of bureaucracy, it's cheaper for them to just cut everybody that was impacted a check than it is for us to fight and deal with the bureaucracy, and really for community and faith-based leaders to stand in the place of government, because then it doesn't feel like they're ever coming, right? And I think, and
I can tell you that more churches rebuilt homes in Mississippi and parts of Louisiana that were not New Orleans than the actual government did, largely because of unclear title. Largely because of that.
So let me ask this. Ashley Shelton is here, founder and executive director of the Power Coalition of Equity and Justice in Louisiana. How much of it is cultural, or that the government understands that the people that are going to complain and actually, force them to do things generally are not the Black folk. So we can do whatever we want and get away with it because they're going to bitch and complain, but then they're not going to really get lawyers. They're not really going to challenge us. And a lot of our property gets seized. A lot of that eminent domain stuff happens to us. Our farm workers don't get their just due because the recourse we have not followed through, which is why we need organizers like you to make sure. How much of that is cultural? Like we were talking on Saturday with Dr. Carr about Howard and these other HBCUs and why they could get away with doing this black mold again and having these issues again, because internally we're not going to really hold them but so accountable.
Well, I think, the one thing I would say that makes this a little different is that, like disasters are equal opportunity, in terms of how they, if you're in the path of the hurricane, you in the path of the hurricane, white, black, or indifferent. Now,
wait. But the Ninth Ward
cover is not equal. Now you're right. Now, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, because that hurricane hit everybody, but the racial inequity allowed for the Ninth Ward to get doubly,
Yep.
and not be rebuilt because I believe of the complexion of the people who are there.
Oh no, I totally agree with you. But what I'm saying though is that that there absolutely is this cultural, aspect to it. But the bigger piece to me is that like culturally, that imminent domain and the things that they were saying right after the storm, it is actually the action and advocacy of Black people, Black and brown people all over this state that said, like, you're not gonna turn my house into a park, because that was the plan. I mean, the Bring Back New Orleans Commission and all these other folks, folks saw their church was gone, their house was gone, everything was green space. And so no, but I think culturally, it's not because we're not going to sue and we're not going to put up a fight. I think what it is that the racial inequity is so powerful and so structurally strong in the Deep South that it is hard to fight it. And I think that what was helpful is that, so usually in the Deep South states like Louisiana, Mississippi, you can get some alignment at the federal level. You can even get, our 3 largest metros are run by, African-American mayors. And so I can work with the local and the feds, and sometimes the state's an issue, right? It just depends, right? The states have been, has been great after Ida to work with. It depends on, every administration is different for every storm. But I think with this particular opportunity, we've been able to, you can leverage what needs to happen. And so like, for example, with Hurricane Ida, these folks are devastated, right? Like they've lost everything. FEMA is struggling to address the temporary housing issue. And folks have been screaming, like, how is it that you knew this was a hurricane, a Category 4 hurricane on the anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, and you didn't think you were going to have any temporary housing available almost immediately after this storm for those folks that lost everything, because there are plenty of them. And there's still folks that don't have electricity, internet, or clean water to drink, right? And so like there's some real stuff that we've got to address. And so in this particular instance, the state itself stepped up because FEMA couldn't move fast enough to be able to address the temporary housing issue. And I think it is because culturally folks are like, we're not gonna keep doing this with government where we don't get the things that we need and the things that we want. But I do think that, again, like these disasters, like there's certainly, like I said, they equal opportunity in one way, but then because of the structural racism and inequity, you certainly then see the recovery come. It happens very much so differently, right? Whose lights get turned on back? Our friends in the river parishes took a direct hit. It's 2 weeks after the storm, no lights, no internet, no anything. And so no plan on when it was going to come on. And, and so we had to work with them to, to make sure that, like they were advocating and having their voices heard to make sure their electricity was turned back on and that they had the resources to start the rebuilding process. But what's crazy is that this is the same community that, you've got Sharon, with Rise St. James, this woman just won the Goldman Award for being one of the most powerful environmental activists in the country. And, literally 2 weeks before the storm, and now she's lost everything, but she is one of the most powerful advocates. She has stopped Formosa from building, a deadly chemical plant in her backyard of her community, but now is faced with, now I got to still advocate. I got to still protect my community, and I got to figure out some way to rebuild my house. And she's not even thinking about her house, but she's trying to help her neighbors rebuild their houses. And so, it's all these layered things that that we're fighting, in particular as Black folks in these disasters, in terms of trying to be whole on the other side of this. And so, Sharon Levine is a true fighter, and they're not gonna hold her down. We've been mucking and gutting. We've been providing hot food. We've been on roofs. We've been putting blue tarps. We've been doing all of those things. But you're right. I mean, I think what I always go back to is that the federal government, both in response to COVID and to natural disasters, which COVID, the federal government is the only engine that has enough money to pay for and to restore, our communities. And I think that we've got to make it accountable. I mean, we just did a roadmap to recovery around all of these ideas, that the ARPA money, the American Rescue Plan money that's already come to some of our communities and is already in many of our states. How are we determining how those dollars are going to get used when many of our cities are talking about surplus dollars? It's not surplus. Right. This is money to make people whole. People that lost their jobs. They behind on the rent. They got, we are in the middle of a housing crisis. It can't be, there's no such thing as a surplus when people are hurting. And we're seeing these dollars being prioritized for police and other things instead of being prioritized for the things that we know help make people whole in the face of these tragedies that we've been through. And I call them that on purpose. There's real trauma having been dealing with COVID and Delta at the same time that we're dealing with, natural disasters. And I do consider them both disasters, but they're combined traumas, and it's a lot. It's a lot.
Is there any sort of concerted or collaborative effort with national organizations that serve underserved folks or that serve Black folks in particular that are ringing the alarm on how are these dollars being distributed in our communities? I think about Mississippi. 38% of the state of Mississippi is African-American. Louisiana, 33% of the people in the state of Louisiana are African-American. You know what I mean? Yep. I mean, Alabama, South Carolina, 27% of the population is African-American. And we're oftentimes the last one to get our communities rebuilt and made whole or given those resources. If we need housing instead of a new park, I don't want to see a dog park in my neighborhood if the houses in my neighborhood of people who've been legacy living there are falling apart, or there's potholes in front of their houses, or their water system is jacked up, right? How do we ring the alarm for our people? 57% of Black folks live in the South right now today in this country. How do we ring the alarm to make sure that we get those dollars that are coming through in some of these plans?
So there's several of us that are working together at the national level to do just that. I mean, Cedric Richmond, he was directly impacted by Hurricane Katrina. Everything he owned in his car with his dog. I mean, literally completely displaced, traveling from town to town, trying to find his way to, a safe place after Hurricane Katrina. And so I think, with this current administration, what we've been saying is that, y'all have people in places that really understand what it is that we're going through, what this looks like, how it impacts community, how it sets a certain number of dominoes that, to fall, that then, like I always tell folks, I said, the cost of helping somebody when it matters most is so minimal compared to what happens when you have overlooked them and not supported them. And so instead of having to pay the couple of $100s, to help somebody patch their roof or to replace the tires on their vehicle or whatever that is, right, turns into $15,000 because you refuse to address it when it was a small problem. You let it grow to now we got to tear all the sheetrock out because there's mold, right? And you let all the we didn't help people in enough time. And so we've been talking at the federal level about that very thing, like we've been working with pastors and organizing at every level of government. And so we've been holding FEMA's feet to the fire, and FEMA's, been responsive. Like we have been saying, like, why are folks being denied when they apply to FEMA? Why are folks, we figured out that there was a way that they were communicating in the letter wrong, right? I was like, this is dumb. I was like, if your letter sounds like a decline letter, but you're really just saying you need more information, then just say you need more information.
Mm-hmm. Ashley Shelton is here. So what is it that you do that makes FEMA respond? What's your magic? What's the thing that you do that everyone listening who lives somewhere can deploy?
I think a couple of things. So one, if you live in a community that's prone to disaster, right? I did an op-ed where I just said, one, don't let people push this narrative of resilience on you. People love to call us resilient. And I was like, we are resilient, beautiful people. However, I said, resilient is short term. I said, I want to be trapped in some never ending cycle of resiliency because no one wants to fix the problem that made me have to be strong in the first place. Like, don't fix it because it's not a life lifestyle. Like resiliency isn't a way of life. Like it's a short-term stretch until we can fix the things that are broken. And so what I would tell folks is organize, but it takes, the things that have been working is working with, we had a Zoom with over 155, faith leaders from across the state that we organized to ask the hard questions. What's going on with temporary housing? Where's the money? How are we going to get the money to the ground? How are people going to get their problems addressed? And then two, to the point Drew made, I mean, Louisiana and Mississippi has the largest Black population in the country. Louisiana has the second, right? And this idea that, like that, how are we mobilizing and using that voice and power to get what we want? And so we've also, another strategy is leveraging our local leaders, our state and local leaders to say, where are you in this? Who are you talking to? Where, are you working with your state legislator? Are you working with the governor so that our voices are heard about what needs to happen here? So for example, they set arbitrary deadlines at FEMA. They're like, okay, today's the last day for critical needs assistance. Well, if your community don't even have electricity or clean drinking water, how am I supposed to be applying for something when I don't even have internet, right? Like it just doesn't make sense. And so we've got to be able to move quicker. We've got to be able to be more thoughtful. But the idea is the power is in numbers and relationships. And so, one of the most important things is always to speak for yourself, because see, people assume that because a disaster happened and you saw it on TV that, like somebody in Congress knows what actually happened to real people on the ground. They don't know. They're not here.
Yeah.
And you have to be able to communicate your own story. You've got to be able to call your congressman and say, what are you going to do?